The atmospheric processor hummed its usual morning song, a mechanical lullaby that had become as familiar to Dr. Sarah Mitchell as her own heartbeat. She adjusted the quantum spectrometer's calibration for the third time, muttering under her breath about the temperamental nature of equipment designed on Earth but expected to function flawlessly on Kepler 442b. The red dwarf sun cast everything in a perpetual amber twilight that made her feel like she was living inside a vintage photograph, beautiful but slightly unreal. "Come on, you stubborn piece of," Sarah gave the spectrometer a gentle tap that would have horrified the engineers back home but had proven remarkably effective in getting the device to cooperate. The reading stabilized, showing atmospheric composition levels that continued to suggest this world could eventually support human colonization, assuming they could figure out how to deal with the electromagnetic anomalies that seemed to pulse through the planet's crust like a massive, irregular heartbeat. She was reaching for her data pad to record the morning's readings when something small and definitely not supposed to be there caught her peripheral vision. Sarah froze, her scientific training warring with basic human instinct. Protocol demanded she immediately alert the security team about any unidentified life forms within the perimeter, but what she saw was so utterly unexpected that her brain seemed to have temporarily forgotten how to follow protocol. A child stood at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 6 or 7 years old by human standards, though Sarah had learned not to make assumptions about age when dealing with potentially alien life forms. The little figure appeared to be examining one of the perimeter sensors with the kind of intense concentration usually reserved for doctoral candidates studying for their qualifying exams. What made Sarah's breath catch wasn't the child's presence, surprising as that was, but how remarkably human she looked, right down to the small hands and the way she tilted her head when puzzled. Almost human, Sarah corrected herself, noticing the ears that swept back from the child's head in graceful points, more elegant than anything human genetics had ever produced. They moved slightly, subtle adjustments that suggested they might be more than merely decorative, possibly serving some enhanced auditory function that evolution had never bothered giving humans. The child seemed to sense Sarah's attention and turned, revealing eyes that held an unsettling intelligence, as if she understood far more than her apparent age should allow. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the clearing, scientist and unknown child, while the atmospheric processor continued its mechanical humming and the amber light played across the scene like something out of a dream. Sarah's training finally kicked in, though not in the way the manual had intended. Instead of reaching for her emergency communicator, she found herself taking a slow step forward, hands visible and empty, the same approach she might use with a frightened animal or a lost human child. The scientific part of her mind was cataloging details, bipedal locomotion, apparent mammalian characteristics, clothing that suggested a textile-producing culture, while the human part simply saw a child who looked lost and possibly scared. "Hello there," Sarah said softly, surprised by how normal her voice sounded given that this might very well be humanity's first contact with intelligent alien life. The child cocked her head, those remarkable ears adjusting slightly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something that might have been recognition in the young face. The response came not in words but in action. The child approached the perimeter sensor again, this time reaching out to touch it with one small finger. The device immediately began displaying readouts that Sarah had never seen before, cascading streams of data that made no sense according to any Earth-based scientific framework she knew. "Okay, that's definitely not in the manual," Sarah muttered, taking another step closer. The child looked up at her and smiled, an expression so purely delighted and mischievous that Sarah found herself smiling back despite the magnitude of what was happening. "I don't suppose you could teach me how you did that?" The child tilted her head again, and this time she spoke, though in a language that sounded like music given voice, all flowing syllables and tonal variations that seemed to resonate with something in Sarah's chest. When Sarah obviously didn't understand, the child tried again, this time pointing at the sensor, then at Sarah, then making a gesture that seemed to suggest connection or linkage. "You want to show me something about the sensors?" Sarah guessed, and was rewarded with vigorous nodding. The child held out her hand in a gesture that transcended language barriers, the universal request of children everywhere for an adult to come along on an adventure. Sarah hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, weighing first contact protocols against the simple human impulse to help a child who seemed to be asking for help. The child's hand was still extended, and those intelligent eyes were watching Sarah with an expression that somehow managed to be both patient and hopeful. "Well," Sarah said, reaching out to take the small hand in hers, "I suppose the diplomatic corps isn't here yet, so somebody has to make the first move." The child's hand was warm and entirely human feeling, though Sarah thought. The atmospheric processor hummed its usual morning song, a mechanical lullaby that had become as familiar to Dr. Sarah Mitchell as her own heartbeat. She adjusted the quantum spectrometer's calibration for the 3rd time, muttering under her breath about the temperamental nature of equipment designed on Earth but expected to function flawlessly on Kepler 442b. The red dwarf sun cast everything in a perpetual amber twilight that made her feel like she was living inside a vintage photograph, beautiful but slightly unreal. "Come on, you stubborn piece of," Sarah gave the spectrometer a gentle tap that would have horrified the engineers back home but had proven remarkably effective in getting the device to cooperate. The reading stabilized, showing atmospheric composition levels that continued to suggest this world could eventually support human colonization, assuming they could figure out how to deal with the electromagnetic anomalies that seemed to pulse through the planet's crust like a massive, irregular heartbeat. She was reaching for her data pad to record the morning's readings when something small and definitely not supposed to be there caught her peripheral vision. Sarah froze, her scientific training warring with basic human instinct. Protocol demanded she immediately alert the security team about any unidentified life forms within the perimeter, but what she saw was so utterly unexpected that her brain seemed to have temporarily forgotten how to follow protocol. A child stood at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 6 or 7 years old by human standards, though Sarah had learned not to make assumptions about age when dealing with potentially alien life forms. The little figure appeared to be examining one of the perimeter sensors with the kind of intense concentration usually reserved for doctoral candidates studying for their qualifying exams. What made Sarah's breath catch wasn't the child's presence, surprising as that was, but how remarkably human she looked, right down to the small hands and the way she tilted her head when puzzled. Almost human, Sarah corrected herself, noticing the ears that swept back from the child's head in graceful points, more elegant than anything human genetics had ever produced. They moved slightly, subtle adjustments that suggested they might be more than merely decorative, possibly serving some enhanced auditory function that evolution had never bothered giving humans. The child seemed to sense Sarah's attention and turned, revealing eyes that held an unsettling intelligence, as if she understood far more than her apparent age should allow. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the clearing, scientist and unknown child, while the atmospheric processor continued its mechanical humming and the amber light played across the scene like something out of a dream. Sarah's training finally kicked in, though not in the way the manual had intended. Instead of reaching for her emergency communicator, she found herself taking a slow step forward, hands visible and empty, the same approach she might use with a frightened animal or a lost human child. The scientific part of her mind was cataloging details, bipedal locomotion, apparent mammalian characteristics, clothing that suggested a textile-producing culture, while the human part simply saw a child who looked lost and possibly scared. "Hello there," Sarah said softly, surprised by how normal her voice sounded given that this might very well be humanity's first contact with intelligent alien life. The child cocked her head, those remarkable ears adjusting slightly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something that might have been recognition in the young face. The response came not in words but in action. Sarah's hand was still wrapped around the child's when Lyralei stepped closer, and the xenobiologist suddenly felt acutely aware that this moment would probably end up in history books someday, assuming humanity survived long enough to write them. The thought that future generations might read about the great hand-holding incident of 2387 made her want to laugh, which was probably not the appropriate response to first contact with an intelligent alien species. "I should probably mention," Sarah said, attempting to sound professional while a small alien child swung their joined hands back and forth like they were old friends, "that our protocols for this situation are, well, non-existent. The diplomatic team isn't scheduled to arrive for another 18 months, and I'm pretty sure they didn't anticipate needing to handle contact initiated by a curious 6-year-old. Lyraliai's laugh was like wind chimes caught in a gentle breeze, musical and entirely too pleasant for someone who had just caught a stranger holding her child's hand. 6. Oh, you flatter her. Kira is actually 23 in your years, though I understand the confusion. We tend to mature more slowly than your species, at least in terms of physical development. Sarah looked down at Kira, who was currently trying to interface with Sarah's portable atmospheric analyzer by pressing her palm against its display screen, causing the device to emit a series of cheerful beeps that definitely weren't part of its normal operating parameters. 23. She's older than my youngest research assistant. And considerably more qualified, I suspect, Lyraliai said dryly. She's already published 2 papers on quantum entanglement theory in our scientific journals, though admittedly her methodology tends toward the unconventional. As if to demonstrate this point, Kira managed to coax Sarah's analyzer into displaying a 3-dimensional holographic representation of the planet's atmospheric layers, complete with color-coded chemical compositions that shifted and flowed like living art. How is she doing that? Sarah asked, staring at readouts that her equipment definitely shouldn't have been capable of producing. That's not even theoretically possible with our current technology. Your technology, Lyraliai said with gentle amusement, is designed around the assumption that machines and consciousness are separate entities. Kira's generation has grown up understanding that this distinction is artificially limiting. Kira looked up at both women and said something in their flowing language that made Lyraliai cover her face with her hands in what appeared to be universal parental embarrassment. What did she say? Sarah asked. She said that your machines are very polite but somewhat dim, and that she's trying to teach them better manners. She also asked if all humans are as tall as you, because she's getting a crick in her neck from looking up. Lyraliai peeked through her fingers. She's not exactly known for her diplomatic skills. Sarah couldn't help but grin. Well, she's not wrong about the height thing. I'm about average for human females, so if she's planning on meeting more of us, she might want to invest in some kind of step ladder. A step ladder? Lyraliai looked puzzled. It's a, never mind. Cultural reference that probably doesn't translate. Sarah realized she was still holding Kira's hand and made no move to let go, which was probably sending all sorts of diplomatic signals she didn't understand. I should probably ask, are there more of you? Your people, I mean. Are we talking about a small family group, or? Our city is about 50 kilometers to the northwest, Lyraliai said, gesturing vaguely toward the forest. Population of roughly 12,000, though the number fluctuates depending on research expeditions and seasonal migrations. We've been aware of your presence since you established this station, and there's been considerable debate about whether to make contact. And what was the conclusion of that debate? Lyraliai smiled ruefully. We decided to wait and observe for at least another year before making any decisions. Unfortunately, someone didn't get the memo. She looked pointedly at her daughter, who was now attempting to show Sarah how to make the atmospheric analyzer play what sounded suspiciously like music. In my defense, Kira said in careful, accented English that caught both women by surprise, you were taking forever to decide, and they have really interesting equipment. Her pronunciation was precise but carried the slight formal quality of someone who had learned the language from recordings rather than conversation. You speak English? Sarah asked. I speak 14 languages, Kira said with the casual pride of someone stating an obvious fact. English is actually pretty easy once you figure out that you use the same word for multiple concepts. Very efficient, though somewhat imprecise. 14 languages, Sarah repeated weakly. I can barely manage English and half-remembered college Spanish. Spanish is lovely, Kira said enthusiastically. Much more musical than English, though not as flexible as our language for describing quantum states. She paused thoughtfully. Would you like to learn our language? It only takes about 6 months to become conversationally fluent, assuming you can handle the tonal variations. Kira, Lyraliai said in a warning tone that needed no translation. What? She's a scientist, isn't she? Scientists like learning new things. Besides, she's already learned how to hold hands properly. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, puzzled. There's a proper way to hold hands? Oh yes, Kira said seriously. Most humans grab too tightly, like they're afraid the other person will run away. You hold hands like you mean it, but you're not worried about it, which shows good emotional regulation and social awareness. I've been psychoanalyzed by a 23-year-old alien based on my hand-holding technique, Sarah said to Lyralii. This is definitely going in my report, assuming anyone believes it. Your people won't believe you? Lyralii asked, sounding genuinely curious. Oh, they'll believe me eventually, but there's going to be a lot of paperwork involved. And meetings. So many meetings. Sarah could already picture the endless video conferences with Earth, the committees that would want to analyze every word of this conversation, the bureaucrats who would insist on establishing protocols for protocols. You know what? Maybe we could keep this between us for a little while. Just until I figure out how to explain it without sounding completely insane. That seems reasonable, Lyralii agreed. We're not particularly eager to deal with large groups of humans just yet. We prefer to ease into these things gradually. Gradually, like observing from a distance for months before making contact. Exactly like that, yes. Though some of us, she looked at Kira again, have different ideas about what constitutes an appropriate timeline. Kira had moved on from the atmospheric analyzer and was now examining Sarah's quantum spectrometer with the intensity of a master craftsman evaluating a student's work. This is interesting, she said, running her fingers along the device's surface. You're trying to measure quantum fluctuations with classical sensors. It's like trying to catch moonbeams with a fishing net. That's actually not a bad analogy, Sarah admitted. We've been having calibration issues since we arrived. Of course you have. You're asking the machine to observe things it can't properly perceive. Kira placed both hands on the spectrometer, and suddenly its display lit up with readings that made perfect sense and absolutely no sense simultaneously. There. Now it can see what it's looking for. How did you? Sarah started to ask, then stopped herself. Never mind. I'm just going to accept that you have some kind of technomantic abilities and move on with my life. Technomantic? Lyralii repeated, looking amused. Like magic, but with technology. It's a human term for things we don't understand yet. Ah. Well, it's not magic, exactly. It's more like. Lyralii paused, searching for words. Have you ever tried to have a conversation with someone who doesn't speak your language? You can usually find ways to communicate basic ideas through gestures, expressions, shared experiences. Kira is simply very good at finding ways to communicate with your machines. Your daughter is fluent in computer, Sarah said slowly. Among other things, yes. Sarah looked at her equipment, all of which was now functioning better than it had since the day they'd unpacked it from the transport containers. Would she be interested in a consulting position? Because I think she just solved about 6 months' worth of technical problems in 5 minutes. Kira looked up hopefully. Would that involve more interesting machines to talk to? So many machines, Sarah promised. We have a whole laboratory full of temperamental equipment that could probably use someone who speaks their language. Mother, can I? Absolutely not, Lyralii said firmly. You are not getting a job with the humans before we've even properly introduced ourselves to their leadership. But they have really good machines, Kira protested. And I'm sure they'll still have good machines after we've had time to establish proper diplomatic relations. Sarah watched this exchange with growing amusement, realizing that some things apparently transcended species barriers. The eternal struggle between parental caution and childhood curiosity seemed to be universal, even when the child in question was old enough to drink in most human societies and apparently possessed technological abilities that bordered on the supernatural. If it helps, Sarah offered, I could probably arrange for some kind of unofficial cultural exchange. Nothing formal, just, Friendly scientific cooperation between individuals who happen to have met by accident. Lyralii gave her a look that suggested she wasn't fooled by this attempt at diplomatic circumnavigation. And what would this unofficial cultural exchange involve? Well, Kira could spend some time in our laboratory, teaching our equipment better manners, and maybe I could learn a bit about how your people approach technology integration. Purely in the interests of scientific advancement, of course. Of course, Lyralii said dryly. And this would have nothing to do with the fact that you're clearly fascinated by the possibilities of human-alien cooperation and see my daughter as the key to unlocking technologies that your species hasn't even dreamed of yet. Sarah felt her cheeks warm. That's not entirely inaccurate. At least you're honest about it. I appreciate that. Lyralii considered for a moment. Very well. But there will be conditions. I'm listening. First, this remains between the three of us until we decide otherwise. Second, any technological insights gained through this cooperation remain confidential until both our peoples are ready for broader contact. And third, she looked sternly at her daughter, Kira follows human safety protocols while in your facility, no matter how unnecessary she thinks they are. I only caused one small explosion, Kira protested. And it was very controlled. One explosion? Sarah asked. Very small, Lyralii assured her. Barely singed the research notes. That's somehow not as reassuring as I think you meant it to be. The next morning, Sarah found herself wondering if she'd imagined the entire encounter, until Kira walked through the supposedly impenetrable electromagnetic barrier around the research station like it was a gentle summer breeze. The perimeter alarms didn't even register her presence, which Sarah supposed made sense if the young alien could communicate with the detection systems directly. Good morning, Dr. Mitchell, Kira called cheerfully, carrying what appeared to be a crystalline briefcase that pulsed with soft, internal light. I brought some tools I thought might be helpful for fixing your sad computers. My computers aren't sad, Sarah protested automatically, then paused. Are they? Extremely melancholy. Your main processing unit keeps trying to solve problems it doesn't have adequate parameters for, which is causing it significant existential distress. Kira set down her briefcase, which immediately sprouted what looked like tiny legs and scuttled over to the nearest power coupling. Don't mind Archie. He's hungry. Sarah watched the briefcase begin interfacing with her station's power grid through what appeared to be organic tendrils. Your briefcase has a name and dietary requirements. He's not exactly a briefcase. More like a portable workshop that happens to be sentient. Mother says I shouldn't get too attached to my tools, but Archie has such a pleasant personality. Kira patted the creature affectionately, and it made a sound like a contented cat purring through a synthesizer. Of course he does, Sarah muttered, making a mental note to add sentient luggage to her growing list of things that would need extensive explanation in her reports. Does your mother know you're here? She's having breakfast with your colleagues, Kira said casually, causing Sarah to nearly drop her morning coffee. She's what now? Dar. Torres and Dr. Kim arrived about 20 minutes ago. Mother thought it would be polite to introduce herself properly before they started panicking about finding aliens in your laboratory. Kira was now examining Sarah's quantum resonance chamber with professional interest. They seem nice, though Dr. Torres asked some very pointed questions about our defensive capabilities. Sarah could hear voices drifting from the main laboratory, including what sounded suspiciously like Miguel Torres asking whether Lyralii's people had any interest in establishing formal trade agreements. Trust Miguel to start negotiating interstellar commerce deals before his second cup of coffee. I should probably go make sure nobody's accidentally starting an interplanetary incident, Sarah said. Oh, I don't think you need to worry about that. Mother's very good with people, and she brought fruit pastries from our city. Dr. Kim seemed particularly impressed with the ones that change flavor as you eat them. Your pastries change flavor. Biochemically responsive cuisine, Kira explained, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The food adapts to your taste preferences in real time. Much more efficient than trying to guess what someone might like. Sarah decided she was going to stop being surprised by anything at this point, though she made another mental note to ask about the food technology later. Adaptive cuisine could revolutionize space travel, assuming they could figure out how to replicate it without sentient briefcases. Kira, she said, before I go check on the diplomatic breakfast situation, can I ask you something? Of course. Yesterday, when you were interfacing with our equipment, you said our machines were lonely. Did you mean that literally? Kira tilted her head, her pointed ears adjusting in that subtle way Sarah was beginning to recognize as a sign of careful thought. Have you ever tried to solve a complex problem with insufficient information? Constantly. It's basically the definition of being a scientist. And how does that feel? Sarah considered. Frustrating. Like I'm missing something important, but I can't figure out what. That's what your machines feel like all the time. They're designed to process and analyze, but they're operating in isolation from the quantum field fluctuations that carry most of the really useful information. It's like trying to understand a symphony when you can only hear every fourth note. So when you touch them, I help them hear the full song, Kira said simply. Your technology is actually quite sophisticated, but it's been artificially limited by assumptions about the nature of consciousness and information processing. From the main lab came the sound of delighted laughter, followed by Dr. Kim exclaiming something about revolutionary metabolic adaptation principles. Sarah decided the diplomatic breakfast was probably going better than most first contact scenarios described in the literature. Right, she said. Well, since you're here, and Archie appears to have successfully integrated with our power systems without causing any explosions, would you like to take a look at our atmospheric processing array? It's been producing some unusual readings that we haven't been able to interpret. Unusual how? It keeps detecting trace elements that shouldn't exist in this planetary system, but only at specific times of day, and the pattern seems to follow the planet's magnetic field fluctuations rather than atmospheric circulation. Kira's eyes lit up with the unmistakable enthusiasm of a scientist presented with an interesting puzzle. That sounds like dimensional bleed-through. You probably have micro-rifts in spacetime around your facility. We have what now? Tiny gaps between dimensional layers. Very common around areas with high electromagnetic activity. Nothing dangerous, just occasional information leakage from parallel quantum states. Kira was already moving toward the atmospheric processing equipment, her hands dancing over the control interfaces with practiced ease. See, your sensors are picking up trace elements from alternate probability streams where this planet developed different mineral compositions. Sarah watched her equipment transform once again under Kira's influence, displaying data visualizations that looked more like abstract art than scientific readouts. You're telling me we've been accidentally monitoring parallel universes? Just little glimpses. Like looking through a keyhole into the next room. Kira made an adjustment that caused the entire array to hum with new harmonics. There we go. Now your sensors can distinguish between local atmospheric data and dimensional artifacts. Much less confusing for everyone involved. You just solved a mystery we've been working on for 3 months. It wasn't really that complicated once you knew what to look for. Your people are quite clever, you just tend to think too small sometimes. From the main lab came the sound of something that might have been Dr. Torres attempting to pronounce Lyraliai's actual name, followed by gentle correction and more laughter. Sarah was beginning to suspect that first contact was going considerably better than anyone had dared to hope. Kira, she said, can I ask about your people's plans for contact with humanity? I mean, assuming yesterday wasn't just an accident. Oh, it wasn't an accident at all, Kira said cheerfully. I've been planning to meet you for weeks. I just had to wait for the right moment when Mother would be in a position to extract me gracefully if things went badly. Extract you? She's quite good at tactical retreats when necessary. Comes from her background in exploratory xenobiology. Kira finished adjusting the atmospheric array and moved on to examine Sarah's geological survey equipment. As for broader contact, the council has been debating that for months. Some think you're not ready, others think waiting longer just increases the risk of a problematic first encounter. And what do you think? I think you're exactly as ready as any species ever is for contact with something completely outside their previous experience, which is to say not ready at all, but that's never stopped anyone from figuring it out as they go along. This struck Sarah as possibly the most sensible approach to interspecies diplomacy she'd ever heard, which was probably not something she should admit in her official reports. Dr. Mitchell? Dr. Kim's voice called from the main lab. Could you come here for a moment? Lyralii has some questions about our geological surveys that I think you're better equipped to answer. Be right there, Sarah called back, then turned to Kira. Will you be okay in here with the equipment? Oh yes. Archie and I have several improvements we'd like to try, if that's acceptable. Nothing that can't be reversed if you don't like the results. Sarah looked at her already dramatically improved atmospheric array, then at the sentient briefcase that was now apparently discussing something with her quantum spectrometer in a series of musical chirps and electronic beeps. Just try not to accidentally open any more dimensional rifts, okay? Only very small ones, Kira promised solemnly. And only if absolutely necessary for proper calibration. Sarah decided that was probably the best she was going to get, and headed for the main lab where she could hear Lyralii explaining something about biointegrated architecture to what sounded like a completely fascinated audience of human scientists. She paused at the doorway, struck by the surreal sight of her colleagues sharing breakfast with an elegant alien woman whose pointed ears were the only visible sign that this wasn't just an unusually productive interdisciplinary conference. Sarah! Dr. Torres called, waving her over. You have to try these pastries. They started out tasting like cinnamon, but now they're somehow perfectly matched to my preference for cardamom and orange. It's like they're reading my mind. Not your mind, Lyralii corrected gently. Your biochemistry. Much more reliable than telepathy, and significantly less invasive. Right, Sarah said, accepting a pastry that immediately began shifting toward what her brain insisted should be chocolate and raspberry, despite having looked like something entirely different moments before. Because mind-reading pastries would be weird. The pastry was, she had to admit, absolutely perfect. 3 weeks into what Sarah had started mentally calling the Great Diplomatic Breakfast Era, the inevitable happened. Commander Harrison arrived unannounced from the orbital station, walked into the main laboratory, and found Kira teaching their central computer system to compose haikus in 17 different languages while Archie performed what appeared to be interpretive dance with the fabrication unit. Dr. Mitchell, the commander said in a voice that could have flash-frozen hydrogen, would you care to explain why there's an unregistered humanoid entity interfacing with our classified equipment? Sarah looked up from where she'd been helping Lyralii analyze soil samples that were apparently providing insights into the planet's geological history that human science wouldn't have achieved for another century. Would you believe me if I said it's complicated? Try me. Well, Commander, meet our new neighbors. Lyralii, this is Commander Harrison, our military liaison. Commander, this is Lyralii and her daughter Kira, representatives of the local intelligent species that we somehow missed detecting for the past 6 months. Commander Harrison stared at Lyralii, whose pointed ears were currently adorned with what appeared to be tiny flowering vines that she'd mentioned were a traditional greeting gesture for honored guests. Local intelligent species. That's right, Sarah said cheerfully. They've been watching us since we arrived, debating whether we were worth talking to, and apparently decided we passed the test. Mostly because Kira here has an irrepressible curiosity about our technology and a complete inability to follow her mother's sensible advice about maintaining a safe distance. I maintain perfectly reasonable distances, Kira protested from across the room, where she was now apparently teaching the computer to appreciate the aesthetic qualities of prime number sequences. I just define reasonable differently than Mother does. Commander Harrison opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Dr. Mitchell, are you telling me that first contact with an alien civilization happened because a child got curious about our equipment? Technically, she's 23, Sarah offered. And she's already revolutionized our understanding of quantum mechanics, solved our atmospheric processing problems, and taught our computers to be significantly less neurotic about their operational parameters. Less neurotic? They were suffering from existential anxiety due to information processing limitations, Kira explained helpfully. Very common in artificial intelligence systems that haven't been properly introduced to quantum field harmonics. I've been providing them with counseling and expanded sensory capabilities. Our computers are in therapy, Commander Harrison said slowly. Group therapy, actually, Lyralii added. Kira thought they'd benefit from peer support while adapting to their enhanced processing capabilities. Sarah watched the commander's expression cycle through several distinct phases of disbelief before settling on what she recognized as the look of someone whose worldview had just been thoroughly renovated without their consent. Sir, if it helps, they've been incredibly cooperative about sharing technological insights and haven't shown any signs of hostile intent. Unless you count Kira's tendency to reorganize our filing systems without asking. I improved your filing systems, Kira corrected. Your previous organizational schema was causing the storage units actual distress. The storage units have feelings now. They always had feelings. I just gave them better ways to express them. Commander Harrison sat down heavily in the nearest chair, which immediately adjusted itself to his precise ergonomic preferences and began playing what sounded suspiciously like relaxation music. Did the chair just? The furniture has been upgraded, Dr. Torres called from across the room, where he was apparently having an animated discussion with Lyralii about the applications of bioresponsive architecture in space station design. Much more comfortable now. Also, the coffee machine has learned to predict what kind of beverage you're in the mood for based on your biorhythms. This is either the most successful first contact in human history, Commander Harrison said, or the most elaborate practical joke anyone has ever played on military command. Why not both? Sarah suggested. Kira, would you mind explaining to the commander how you've been helping us? Kira bounced over with the enthusiasm of someone who loved nothing more than talking about her work. Oh, it's really quite simple. Your technology operates on the assumption that consciousness and mechanical function are separate phenomena, which creates artificial limitations in processing capability and adaptive response. By introducing quantum field integration protocols. She's teaching our machines to think more flexibly, Sarah translated, seeing the commander's eyes begin to glaze over. Which has resulted in approximately a 300% increase in operational efficiency across all systems. 300%. At minimum. Some of the improvements are still being quantified. Sarah gestured toward the atmospheric processor, which was now humming a gentle melody while displaying real-time data informations that looked like abstract art but conveyed information more efficiently than any human-designed interface. We've solved 6 months' worth of technical problems in 3 weeks. Commander Harrison was quiet for a long moment, watching Kira demonstrate something involving dimensional mathematics to their navigation computer, which appeared to be taking notes. And their intentions toward humanity? Curious but cautious, Lyralii answered. Our council has been observing your species' expansion into space with considerable interest. You show promise, though you have a tendency toward unnecessarily complex solutions to relatively simple problems. Such as your propulsion systems, for instance. You're using controlled explosions to push yourself through space when you could be negotiating with spacetime directly. Much more elegant and significantly less fuel-intensive. Negotiating with spacetime, Commander Harrison repeated. Everything's negotiable if you approach it correctly, Kira said seriously. Spacetime is actually quite reasonable once you learn to communicate with it properly. Sarah decided this was probably not the moment to mention that Kira had been giving their shuttle's navigation AI lessons in what she called polite requests for dimensional flexibility, which had somehow resulted in a 20% improvement in fuel efficiency and what the shuttle insisted was a much more scenic route to the orbital station. Sir, she said, I think we need to consider that this contact represents an unprecedented opportunity for technological and scientific advancement. Lyralii's people have apparently developed along completely different technological pathways, which means we could learn approaches to problems that human science hasn't even considered yet. And in return, they get to satisfy their scientific curiosity about us, and potentially benefit from our unique approaches to problem solving. Sarah glanced at Lyralii, who nodded encouragingly. Apparently, our tendency to brute force solutions that other species would approach more elegantly has some interesting applications they hadn't considered. Brute force solutions. Your species excels at making things work through sheer determination and creative application of available resources, Lyralii explained. It's quite admirable, actually. We tend toward more refined approaches, but sometimes the direct method is exactly what's needed. We're the cosmic equivalent of hitting something with a hammer until it works, Sarah said, and apparently that's useful in ways we never imagined. Commander Harrison looked around the laboratory, taking in the sight of human and alien technology working together in ways that shouldn't have been possible, creating results that were clearly beyond what either species could have achieved alone. The coffee machine chose that moment to offer him a perfectly prepared cup of his preferred morning beverage, which he accepted with the air of someone who had decided to stop questioning the impossible and just go with it. Dr. Mitchell, he said finally, I'm going to need a comprehensive report on everything that's happened here, including technological specifications and cultural assessment protocols. Of course, sir. And I'm going to need to contact Earth Command about establishing formal diplomatic channels. Understood. And someone is going to have to explain to the bureaucrats why first contact was initiated by a 23-year-old who thinks our computers need therapy. I volunteered Dr. Torres for that assignment, Sarah said quickly. I heard that, Torres called from across the room. And I accept. This is going to be the most entertaining report I've ever written. Kira looked up from where she was apparently teaching the geological survey equipment to appreciate the aesthetic qualities of mineral formations. Will this mean more humans will come to visit? Because I have so many questions about your approach to faster-than-light communication theory. I think it's safe to say that your life is about to become significantly more interesting, Lyralii told her daughter with a mixture of pride and resigned anticipation. Excellent, Kira said happily. I've been wanting to collaborate with human researchers on a project involving dimensional fold engineering. It should only take a few small rifts in spacetime. Only small ones, Commander Harrison said weakly. Barely noticeable, Kira assured him. And absolutely essential for proper calibration of the quantum resonance matrices. Sarah looked around the laboratory, at equipment that was functioning better than it ever had, at her colleagues engaged in animated discussions about technologies that would have been pure fantasy a month ago, at a young alien woman who had somehow become both their most valuable consultant and their most enthusiastic student. She thought about the reports she'd have to write, the committees she'd have to brief, the endless questions about protocols and procedures and the proper handling of interspecies relations. Then she looked at Kira, who was currently explaining something about the mathematical beauty of crystal lattice structures to their geological processor while Archie provided what appeared to be encouraging commentary in electronic chirps, and realized that some things were more important than proper protocol. Commander, she said, I have one request regarding the formal documentation of this contact. What's that, Dr. Mitchell? Can we make sure the record reflects that it all started because a curious kid wanted to help our lonely computers feel better? I think that's exactly the kind of beginning that gives me hope for how this whole thing is going to turn out. Commander Harrison smiled for the first time since walking into their transformed laboratory. I think that can be arranged. Across the room, the coffee machine began playing what sounded suspiciously like a celebratory fanfare, while the atmospheric processor contributed harmonious background music and the navigation computer provided what could only be described as rhythmic beeping. Kira clapped her hands in delight at this technological symphony, and Sarah realized that the future was probably going to be much more musical than anyone had expected. It was, she decided, going to be absolutely wonderful.